I came home from a week on base and found my driveway buried under 6 inches of fresh concrete. No warning, no note, just gone. And the guy who did it was standing in the middle of his brand new courtyard smiling like he'd just finished a landscaping project. The crazy part is, he honestly believed there was nothing I could do about it. Now, before I get into what happened next, you need to understand how that driveway even existed in the first place, because the whole story really starts about 15 years earlier. I live outside a small town in western Pennsylvania called Millbrook Ridge. It's one of those places where the roads get narrower the further you go out, and eventually the pavement just turns into gravel and then into something that technically counts as a road, but mostly exists because people keep driving on it. My house sits at the very end of a private access lane. Picture two properties in a line. The front property touches the main road. Mine sits behind it, tucked back in the trees where you can't even see it unless you know it's there. When I bought the place back in 2009, the realtor explained the arrangement pretty clearly. There was a recorded easement, permanent, legally filed with the county, that allowed the owner of my property to use a strip of land cutting across the front parcel. That strip was the driveway. It wasn't a handshake agreement. It wasn't a neighbor being nice. It was written into the land records. Survey maps, coordinates, everything. Which meant no matter who owned the front property, that access had to stay open. That driveway was literally the only way to reach my house unless you wanted to bulldoze half a forest and build a road from the other side of the hill. At the time, the front property belonged to an older couple, Harold and June Whitaker. Sweet people. Retired school teachers. Harold used to wave whenever I drove past. Sometimes he'd stand at the mailbox with a cup of coffee like he was conducting traffic for the two vehicles that might pass through on a busy day. For years, things were peaceful, quiet. I spent a lot of time away because of my Army Reserve commitments. But when I was home, life out there felt calm in a way most places don't anymore. Then about 2 years ago, Harold passed away. June moved to Florida to be near her daughter, and the property went on the market. That's when the trouble showed up. The buyers were a couple named Brent and Lydia Calloway. They were different from anyone who had lived out there before. You could tell from the first week. 3 different luxury SUVs pulling in. Contractors walking around with tablets. A drone flying overhead taking aerial photos. About a month later, the old Whitaker house was demolished. Completely gone. In its place, construction crews started building what I can only describe as a glass and steel spaceship. Flat roof. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Massive concrete walls. The kind of house you see in architecture magazines where everything looks expensive and uncomfortable at the same time. At first, I didn't think much about it. People build big houses all the time. The trucks were loud, sure. Concrete mixers rumbling up the driveway, lumber deliveries, generators running all day. But construction projects end eventually. Or at least that's what I figured. The first time I actually met Brent was one afternoon when I was pulling back from the grocery store. He was standing near the construction fence wearing sunglasses and holding a blueprint roll under his arm like he was posing for a real estate ad. I slowed down, rolled my window halfway. He gave me a quick nod. "You live back there?" he asked, pointing past the site toward my property. "Yeah," I said. "Been there a while." He glanced at the driveway, then back at the construction area. "Ever thought about relocating this access road?" The way he said it caught my attention. Not curious. More like strategic. I shrugged. "Not really my decision. That's a recorded easement." He gave a small laugh. Right, but things change." I remember pausing for a second because something about his tone felt off. So I explained it again. "The easement's filed with the county. It's permanent." He smiled the way people do when they're pretending to agree with you, but clearly don't. "Well," he said, tapping the blueprint tube against his palm, "we're redesigning the approach to the house. A cleaner visual line from the road." I nodded slowly. "Okay." Then I drove past him and went home. At the time, it didn't feel like an argument. More like a preview. Over the next 2 months, the construction got heavier. Steel beams showed up. Glass panels taller than a pickup truck. One day, they poured a giant foundation slab that looked big enough to land a helicopter on. But through all of it, the driveway stayed exactly where it had always been. I'd pass through every morning on my way to town, weaving around cement trucks and stacks of lumber, and no one ever said another word about it. Which, looking back, was probably the first sign something wasn't right. Because people like Brent Calloway don't usually drop ideas that easily. Then one Monday morning, I got a call from my unit. They needed me at Fort Belvoir for a short training rotation. 7 days. Nothing unusual. I packed a duffel, locked up the house, and drove out the driveway like I had 1,000 times before. The construction crew was already on site. Generators humming. Workers unloading bags of cement. Brent's black Range Rover parked by the temporary fence. He didn't wave when I passed. Just watched. At the time, I barely noticed. 7 days later, I drove back into Millbrook Ridge around 9 p.m. It had been raining earlier, and the road still smelled like wet asphalt and pine needles. Everything felt normal. Until I reached the entrance to the driveway. I slowed down automatically like always. And then I just stopped. Because the driveway wasn't there anymore. Where the gravel strip had been for 15 years was now a wide concrete courtyard stretching from the front of Brent's new mansion all the way to the road. Decorative stone planters lined the sides. Landscape lights were embedded along the edges. And right in the middle, exactly where my access lane used to run, was 6 inches of perfectly finished reinforced concrete. For a moment, I honestly thought I had taken a wrong turn. I sat there with the headlights shining across the courtyard, trying to process what I was seeing. That's when the front door of the mansion opened, and Brent Calloway stepped outside. He walked toward my truck slowly, hands in his pockets like we were about to chat about the weather. I rolled down the window. "Brent," I said, looking past him at the concrete. "What happened to the driveway?" He glanced back over his shoulder like he hadn't noticed it before. "Oh, that," he said casually. "We redesigned the front approach." Then he nodded toward the courtyard. "Looks good, right?" For a few seconds, I didn't even respond. Because the question running through my mind wasn't about design. It was one simple thing. How exactly did this guy think I was supposed to get to my house? And that's when the real conversation started. For a few seconds, I just sat there with the engine idling, staring past Brent at that giant slab of concrete where my driveway used to be. The rain had stopped, but the pavement was still wet, and the headlights from my truck were reflecting off the courtyard like it was a mirror. It looked expensive, really expensive, which made what he'd just done even harder to believe. I leaned my arm on the window frame and said the first thing that came to mind. "Brent, you poured concrete over my access road." He tilted his head slightly, like we were discussing something minor. "Well, technically, it was part of the front landscaping plan." I blinked. "That road leads to my house." He nodded like he understood the sentence, but not the importance of it. "Right. But we figured you could probably add another driveway from the side street." Now, if you've never been out to Millbrook Ridge, the idea of adding another driveway sounds simple enough. But the side street he was talking about sat on the other side of a steep wooded slope. To reach my property from there, you'd have to clear trees, blast rock, and build about 200 yards of new road through hillside. It would cost a fortune, and Brent knew it. I took a slow breath. "You remember when we talked about the easement?" He shrugged. "You mentioned something like that." "It's not something like that," I said. "It's recorded with the county. This driveway is legally protected." For a moment, he just stared at me, the faintest smirk on his face. Then he gave a little shrug. "Well," he said, "if there's paperwork involved, I guess you'll have to sort that out with somebody." And with that, he turned around and walked back toward his house. Just like that. Conversation over. Door closed. Lights on inside. And I was still sitting in my truck staring at a courtyard where my road used to be. I didn't yell. Didn't bang on his door. Honestly, I think the shock was still settling in. So instead, I backed out slowly, drove down the road, and checked into the small highway motel about 10 miles away. The kind of place with flickering hallway lights and a vending machine that hasn't been restocked since 2012. I barely slept that night. My brain kept replaying the scene over and over. Part of me wondered if there was some misunderstanding. Maybe the crew poured the slab in the wrong spot. Maybe Brent assumed the easement was somewhere else. But deep down, I knew exactly what had happened. He thought if he built over it fast enough, I'd just give up. The next morning, I drove home, or as close to home as I could get, parked along the road, and walked the rest of the way up to the house. From ground level, the courtyard looked even bigger. Smooth gray concrete stretching across the entire front of the property. There were decorative stone boxes placed every 10 feet, with small maple trees planted inside them. Low-voltage lights embedded along the edges. The whole thing looked like something you'd see outside a luxury hotel. Right through the middle of it was where my driveway used to run. I stood there for a while, hands on my hips, just taking it in. Then I went inside my house and dug out the closing paperwork from when I bought the property. Every land purchase comes with a stack of documents about 3 inches thick. Most people never look at them again. But buried inside that stack was the easement agreement. I found it in about 10 minutes. There it was. A map. Survey coordinates. Exact measurements. A 30-foot wide strip cutting straight across the front parcel, precisely where Brent had just poured his courtyard. And the wording was crystal clear. Perpetual access easement. Meaning permanent. Meaning it didn't expire. Meaning the owner of the front property couldn't block it, alter it, or build over it. I stared at that document for a long moment. Then I grabbed my keys and drove to the county recorder's office. Small government building, fluorescent lights, the faint smell of old paper and coffee. The clerk at the counter looked about 60 and had reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. I slid the paperwork across the desk. "Morning," I said. "I need certified copies of this easement." She scanned the first page, then the attached survey. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Property dispute?" she asked. "You could say that." She disappeared into the back room for a few minutes. When she came back, she handed me 2 stamped copies with the county seal on them. "Good luck," she said. Something about the way she said it made me wonder how many neighbor wars she'd seen over the years. Next stop was a surveying company in town. A guy named Paul Ramirez ran it. Stocky guy in his 50s, sunburned neck, tape measure clipped to his belt even inside the office. I laid the map on his desk. "I need the easement boundaries marked on the ground." He studied it for a minute. Then he asked, "What's sitting on top of it?" "Concrete courtyard." Paul looked up slowly. "Recently poured?" "Last week." He leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "Whoever did that didn't check the records." "Oh," I said. "I think he did." Paul chuckled. "Well, this should be interesting." 2 days later, he showed up at the property with a tripod laser level, a measuring wheel, and a box of bright orange survey stakes. Brent's construction crew was still working when we pulled up. Workers hauling materials. Someone installing glass panels on the second floor. A few of them looked confused as Paul started setting up his equipment in the middle of the courtyard. Brent came out about 10 minutes later. You could see the irritation on his face before he even reached us. "What's this?" he asked. Paul didn't answer. He just checked his measurements, walked 10 feet forward, and hammered the first orange stake straight into the concrete seam line. Thunk. Then another. And another. Each one forming a straight line that ran directly through the center of the courtyard. Brent watched the whole thing, arms crossed. Finally, he looked at me. "You're really doing this?" I held up the certified easement document. "I didn't start it." He scoffed. "This is ridiculous." Paul finished placing the last stake and wiped his hands on his jeans. "That's the easement boundary," he said calmly. 30 feet wide, running right through here. Brent looked from the stakes to the mansion behind him, then back to me. "You think a couple of sticks in the ground are going to stop this project?" I shrugged. "Not the sticks." Then I folded the document and slid it back into my folder. "But the judge might." That afternoon, I met with a real estate attorney in town named Melissa Harper. Her office sat above a bakery that smelled like cinnamon rolls all day long. I told her the entire story from beginning to end. When I finished, she didn't laugh, didn't look surprised. She just tapped the easement document with her pen and said something I'll never forget. "Well, that's a very expensive mistake." She explained the next steps in calm, lawyer language. "We'd file for an emergency injunction. That would force the construction to stop until the easement issue was resolved. Normally, these things take weeks, sometimes months. But when property access is blocked completely, courts move faster." 3 days later, the judge signed the order. Construction on Brent Calloway's $1 million mansion stopped immediately. But here's the thing Brent still didn't know. And the moment Melissa pointed it out, I realized this situation was about to get a lot worse for him. Because according to the utility maps attached to the property plans, the underground power line feeding his new house ran directly beneath that same easement strip. And that changed everything. When Melissa pointed to the utility map, I leaned forward in my chair a little. At first, it just looked like a bunch of colored lines running across the property diagram. Then she tapped one of them with her pen. "This," she said, "is the underground electrical feed for the Calloway house." The line started at the main road, cut across the front property, and ran directly beneath the exact easement strip where my driveway had always been, right through the courtyard. Melissa leaned back slightly and folded her hands. "Utility companies maintain access rights to their lines," she said. "And easements like yours protect that access. No permanent structures are supposed to block it." I stared down at the paper. "So pouring 6 inches of reinforced concrete over it?" She gave a small smile. That complicates things. That was the lawyer version of saying Brent had just stepped into something deep. The next call she made was to the regional electric utility. Not to complain, just to inform. Apparently, companies that manage underground power lines take obstruction issues pretty seriously. Within a week, 2 white utility trucks showed up at Brent's property. I happened to be there that morning, standing near the edge of the road when they arrived. The workers stepped out carrying clipboards and bright yellow warning flags. They walked straight toward the courtyard. Brent came outside about 30 seconds later looking irritated. I couldn't hear the entire conversation, but I caught enough pieces drifting across the yard. Easement violation. Line access requirements. Cannot connect permanent service. Brent's voice got louder. This is ridiculous. The house is almost finished. One of the utility guys stayed calm. Sir, until that obstruction is removed, we can't activate the electrical line. Brent pointed toward the house behind him. You're telling me the entire property can't have power because of that? The worker didn't even hesitate. Yes, sir. And that was the moment the reality started sinking in. Because Brent's mansion was nearly complete by then. Glass installed. Interior finished. Landscaping underway. But without electrical service, the place might as well have been a sculpture. No lights. No HVAC. No appliances. And most importantly, no occupancy permit from the county. The construction crews packed up pretty quickly after that. Once the injunction went through, they weren't legally allowed to keep working anyway. So for the next few weeks, the entire site just sat there. A half-finished luxury mansion with a perfect concrete courtyard and a row of bright orange survey stakes cutting straight through the middle like a scar. I won't lie, there was a strange kind of quiet satisfaction every time I drove past it. Not because I enjoy watching people's projects fail, but because Brent had acted like rules didn't apply to him, and reality was starting to disagree. About a month later, the official notices started arriving. First from the court confirming the easement obstruction, then from the utility company explaining what had to happen before power could be connected. Remove the concrete, restore the access path, allow proper utility access again. There wasn't really any negotiating around that. The slab had to come out, and removing reinforced concrete that thick isn't cheap. The demolition alone ended up costing somewhere around $70,000, maybe more. Jackhammers showed up one morning around 7 a.m. Huge machines tearing into the courtyard piece by piece. Chunks of decorative stone getting hauled away in dump trucks. Landscape lighting ripped out. Planters smashed apart. Every swing of those jackhammers basically erased another piece of Brent's big redesign. I watched part of it from the road one afternoon. Brent stood nearby with his hands on his hips while the workers broke apart the center section where the easement ran. At one point, he noticed me parked there. Our eyes met across the yard. For a second, it looked like he might walk over. But he didn't. He just turned away and kept watching the demolition. The process dragged on for weeks. Concrete removal, ground grading, then finally rebuilding the driveway exactly where it had always been. Same width, same route. Gravel base restored right down the middle of what used to be his courtyard. The utility company inspected the line access once everything was cleared. Only after that did they approve permanent electrical service. By then, nearly 8 months had passed since the night I came home and found the driveway gone. 8 months of a finished mansion sitting dark. No lights glowing through those giant glass windows. No one living inside. Just a massive modern house, quietly waiting for power. Sometime during that stretch, Brent tried to change tactics. One afternoon, he actually drove up my restored driveway and knocked on my door. That was the first time he had come to my house. I opened the door, and there he was standing on the porch, looking a lot less confident than the first time we talked. "Can we discuss a solution?" he asked. I stepped outside. "What kind of solution?" He gestured vaguely toward the front property. "I'm willing to buy your house." That caught me off guard for about half a second. Then I shook my head. "Not interested." He pressed his lips together. "Well, what about relocating the easement properly? We could compensate you." I thought about the last 8 months. The concrete. The shrug. The way he had told me to take it up with someone. So I gave him the same calm tone he had used that night. "No." For a moment, he just stood there. Then he nodded slowly like he had expected that answer all along. "All right," he said quietly. And he walked back down the driveway. After that, we didn't talk again. The driveway stayed exactly where it had always been. The mansion eventually got its electricity. People started living there not long after. From the outside, everything probably looks normal now. But every time I drive past that house, I still see the ghost of that courtyard that used to sit there. A really expensive reminder that property laws exist for a reason. Here's the thing, though. Some people say I should have taken the offer, sold the house, made some money, and avoided all the stress. Others think Brent got exactly what he deserved for trying to bulldoze someone else's rights. And honestly, I can see both sides. So now I'm curious what you think. If you came home from deployment and found your only driveway buried under someone else's concrete, would you have fought it the way I did? Or would you have taken the money and walked away? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about real neighborhood conflicts like this one, make sure to like the video and subscribe, because trust me, sometimes the quietest roads have the wildest stories.